If you're not familiar with SHRM, it's the Society of HR Management or something like that is what it stands. I don't even know if my name for the acronym's right, but sure, it's a huge HR association. Okay. Human Resources Association. They do tons of data. They put out tons of certifications, all this. And one of the reports or the data briefs they put out was a report on the jobs at risk in U.S. employment with the age of automation. So if you want to go look it up, you can look it up. It's called Jobs at Risk, U.S. Employment in the New Age of Automation. And really what it did was it was a detailed breakdown of assessing, we're hearing all this hype and all this noise about AI is going to take all our jobs. It's going to take everyone's jobs. It's going to whatever. And, it's creating a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of this stuff. And then, so it's like, well, is there merit to that? So I dug through the report. And so I wanted to share my response and reaction to it because I think in some ways it can be helpful. I think in some ways, I don't know. I mean, I get they're basing this on data, but the one thing I know about the association and some of this stuff is it's not necessarily objective. And it's also data coming out of HR, which isn't necessarily as close and tied to the business as some of the business leaders are. So I've just been around the block long enough to know that sometimes what HR thinks isn't necessarily where the business is. So I want to kind of give some context around what this is. But what they came out to say was their big headline was 12% of U.S. employment is at high or very high risk for total automation displacement. Okay, so when you're looking at the factors of this, when they say 12, it was like 12.6 or 12.3. I get the numbers mixed up in my head, but ultimately just a little over 10%. Okay. So, for every 100 jobs, 12 of them will literally are on the chopping block to be at high risk or very high risk for complete elimination. I'm looking at the chart right here. It's more like 2% are very high. So 2 out of 100 jobs are basically, according to this report, it's like they just straight up aren't going to exist. 10% are on the high. Okay, so it's close to 13%. But anyway, so that's how it breaks down. Then you kind of get into the moderate. Moderate's more like 25%. Slight is 23.9%. And then negligible is 40%. So when you think about the data through that sense, what I don't like about the report, I'm just sharing my thoughts based on conversations I have in executive advisory and board meetings where things are coming up like this. I don't necessarily think the numbers are completely skewed if you're looking at it on a macro level. So if you were to just look across all jobs, all industries, all functions, I actually think this probably is a fairly accurate assessment of where I would probably benchmark based on anecdotal conversations and things. Like the number of jobs that people are going, yeah, that's just not even going to exist anymore. We're not even going to have that. I would say that is probably pretty minimal in terms of like 2% where people are already very confident that's just gone. And I do think the 10% is pretty close to accurate in terms. And again, when I'm defining this, I don't know, based on the report, it's an HR report, so it's very risk averse. So they don't make a lot of bold statements. So you're not going to read the report and go, so are they saying those jobs won't exist or they will exist? They're not going to come out and straight say that. The way I understand the report and what I would agree with is that in that rough range, I would say about 2% of actual jobs, there are plenty of people just going, yeah, we're not even going to have that anymore. And then about 10% people were like, it might exist, but it may be so negligible, or it may be changed so much so that, we don't even need to think about it. It's just maybe a little further down the road. I'd say those 10% are probably the ones people in their heads are going, we're going to automate it. It's just we aren't there yet. I think that's fair. I think what the report doesn't necessarily represent, and where we're seeing some of the hype around it, is those jobs that are in the high to very high. For some companies, that is the whole company. And so what I find is in a lot of the news where you see hype about mass downsizing. You'll see companies, they're getting rid of 20%, 25% of the workforce as a direct result of AI. You go, how can you get to rid of 20% and then say only 2% of the jobs? Well, a lot of times when I look at the companies that are being impacted by this, their whole company or a large part of their company is that very high risk thing. So when a large part of your company is that very high risk thing, the percentage is going to get skewed. In general, would I agree that probably most organizations, I would actually say many organizations are struggling to even figure out how to go about doing the elimination stuff. And so in some ways, I don't want to give people too much confidence, but in some ways, I would actually say it's less about are the jobs eligible for AI automation and risk, and more are the organizations ready to actually do it. Now, if you were to rate those things, I think you would see two very different scales, because I think people can generally start to say, I see a lot of risk here, not much risk here, this and that. But even the ones where they go, that job is absolutely going to be automated. Most companies I talk to, if you're like, so are you ready to do that? They're like, oh no, like we're not even close to that yet. We're thinking about it. What you're seeing in the news and some of the hype around it is some companies are going, well, we just know that's where we're going, so we're just going to rip off the Band-Aid and hope we'll figure it out. And I told you I'm ending on a positive note, so stick around and listen for that, because if you hear that and panicked, I've got some encouraging news for you. Now, what was interesting in the report, and it's something that you'll want to dig into as well, and I'd encourage you to explore it, was they actually broke it down by where are what industries. So they got into some of the industries, which was really interesting to see, like where were some of the highest risk things. And what's interesting is business and financial is actually the highest, which I think is very unsettling, and which is why you're seeing so much hype around it right now, is that historically has been seen as untouchable. Kind of the corporate finance, business leadership, operational role, that's been seen as like, yeah, that can't get automated. Well, all of a sudden, generative AI has changed that significantly. And so business operations roles suddenly are like on the chopping block. So like they're of the 19.9%, like the way they, risk of automation. Because again, now I'm breaking it down further. So the first one was just at a macro level, what it would look like, only 10%, and then the 2% very high. Then it drilled into those high, very high, and said, now where is that split? Like, where does that look from an industry standpoint? And as you get into that, it's like business and financial ops was at the top. Production was at the top. One of the things I thought was really interesting was protective service, which speaks to some of this automation of robotics and things like that. A lot of the AI systems to be able to detect, even just having physical robots doing some of that. So it was interesting seeing what was at the top of the pile. And I think that's where there's a lot of unsettling news for people, is there's some things in this mix, production, as in like supply chain manufacturing. I don't necessarily think that always surprises people, because they go, well, yeah, we're going to have machines building more stuff. We're seeing more with robots do some of that. When all of a sudden business and financial tops the charts, I think that's why you're seeing people go, we weren't really planning that type of a thing. And so if you wanted to go, all the way down, but even if you look into it, like farming and forestry is way up there. So to some of the people I talked to who are like, oh, this is not going to be touched. I mean, building and grounds maintenance was a double digits type of a thing. So there were some industries that interestingly were, I think a lot of people went, oh, holy cow. Like there's some industries that historically would have never made this list that are now on the list. And I think that's why there's more hype associated with this automation, not so much that the risk isn't there or we haven't been automating things in the past. And so I think thinking about this critically is really important as you go into it. Now, I think as we break this down, I want to give some kind of perspective for how people should be thinking about this. What I wouldn't want somebody to walk away from is the idea that, oh, okay, so really what you're saying, Christopher, is there's really only like 1 to 1.2 out of 10 people whose jobs are very much at risk. I still, despite this report, stand behind the fact that everybody's job is going to be displaced by AI in some capacity. Okay. The job you have today will not be the job you have in 2 years. And I really don't care what industry you're in. I don't care what field you're in. It really doesn't matter. The people who are adopting AI and figuring out where AI makes sense are going to come and cannibalize that and redefine the jobs. So to the people who are resistant and go, well, I think I'm in the negligible or slight category, so I'm not going to worry about that. What I'm telling you is someone is doing that job right now and figuring out where AI is helping them. I had an interesting call with a good friend of mine who's in real estate, and he was talking about some of the inspection stuff that he does. And my whole point was, I know real estate agents that are looking at how to equip drones and schedule them to go do some of the inspection work ahead of time. So they only have to send somebody in and they can do 10 in a day rather than 3. Yes, that would probably be something that would fall into the negligible category, but somebody's figuring out how to use AI to do it, and they're going to eat your lunch if you're not also doing it. So to the people who are resistant, I just really do want to push you to say, you need to be thinking about this. And again, it doesn't mean, I've said this before, it doesn't mean you have to be the AI person. But what it does mean is if you're not, then you have to develop what is your competitive edge that so stands out that when somebody comes around and goes, I can do it for less or I can do it for faster, people are going to go, I'm going to stick with you because, and it can't just be because a person does it. That's just not going to hold water, or it's not, unless you're really just going to be an S tier person who only works with the people with the financial resources to do it. And they can go, I can pay a premium to have a person do it. And of course, I'd rather have a person do it. The vast majority of people who are already financially and economically strapped, they're going to go with the person who can do it for a fraction of the cost because they've brought AI in. So it's just more about understanding, well, who's your market? What are you trying to do? How's this going to fit together so that you can make a decision? And ultimately knowing, just because this report says only 12% are high or very high, doesn't mean that, it's only going to affect a certain portion of the population. It's moving slower than I think some people anticipated, but I think in other ways it's moving faster than some people anticipated. So my advice is on the, employee side. If you're an employee, a leader, whatever you are, I think the data is clear. There's really nobody who, even the 40% that are negligible, I tried to dig into it a little more. I'm like, negligible how? To say it's, to me, this is a HR misunderstanding of how work really happens. I don't think anybody will be negligibly impacted by AI. I think everybody will moderately or high impacted by AI. It's just a matter of, the time you'll have to adapt, what it will look like, and how much of a priority it is for your company. There's some jobs that companies just go, it's not really worth us taking the time to understand what AI can do and then trying to make the adjustment. So we're just not going to spend the time on. We could, it's just not worth it for us to take the time. Because the reality is, and this can hopefully bring some peace of mind to folks, is that it still takes time. There's, as much as the marketing hype out there is saying you can just buy this agent, flip a switch, and magically you don't need people anymore, which you'll hear about when I talk about it later. It doesn't work that way. And companies are finding that out. And so they're having to be selective of where they're choosing. And I think that's why we're starting to see the pyramid flip in terms of where are they going. Well, now they're starting to look at some of these high cost roles that historically have been untouchable, that now are becoming much more automatable. And it's giving people an opportunity to do this. Now, if you're a business leader, this is where this report may be helpful for you to start thinking about, hey, where does this actually look? And in 2 ways. One, if you're a business leader and going, we absolutely can automate everything, this report should bring you back down to earth and go, oh, maybe not. Maybe the hype and all the noise about we can do this everywhere, maybe we need to think a little more carefully about it. But it also should be something that business leaders, if you're in an industry where you thought, oh, nobody's going to touch this stuff. It's like, really? Because I guarantee I know lots of people in some of these industries that historically have been untouchable, that now it's like, yeah, it's at the top of the pile for high displacement risk. So if you're a business leader making decisions about it, you need to be paying attention. Now, listen till the end, because I'm going to tell you why. Be very careful how you do that. But I do think it's something that nobody can sit and be complacent. And I think this report highlights that. But I would be careful about some of the things that I'm seeing come out of this that are just being, broadcast, because I'm seeing it used all over the place. I'm seeing things that basically 12% of people are going to be out of work by 2026. And I'm like, okay, that's not what this report's seeing. Then I'm also seeing the flip of that, that's saying, oh, for all the hype, actually only 2% of jobs are actually at risk of being disrupted by AI. And I'm like, that's actually not what it's saying at all. And I actually don't agree with the report in its assessment that, there's such a large amount that are negligible, as in terms of, oh yeah, AI doesn't even affect it. It's like, no, there's nobody that's actually negligible. So encourage you to check it out. If you like looking at reports and the details, you can actually get into how they actually calculated this. I'm not going to break down their calculation, but based on where they're getting the data and the group that I know is doing it, that's where I would say it's a helpful indicator. I would not necessarily bring this into a board meeting and say, this is how we're going to make a decision.